Hello, and welcome back to the Progress Report. I'm Sarah B. Nelson, and I'm your host. And today we're exploring a challenge that's in front of every state and local government officials. How do you sustain citizen trust as AI becomes more a part of our lives and more deeply embedded in the public space? There's so much buzz about trust in AI. I think we all can agree on that. But there was a Pew Research Center study that I thought summed up the general public sentiment as concisely as I've seen it, which is that people are generally excited about the use of AI, but they may have concerns, especially when it comes to the government's use of AI. So this statement was based on more than 3,600 people in 25 countries. So it is, I think we can agree, it's a fairly global concern. So our core question then becomes, what happens when AI reshapes how government delivers public services? How can our agencies assure that the people they protect and serve, that AI is trustworthy, that it's being used responsibly, and it truly is for the public good? So today we're going to explore these questions with Doug Gartner, who's a principal solutions architect at AWS, and my colleague, Anita Mikus. She's the managing director for U.S. state and local government accounts here at Kyndryl. So Doug and Anita, welcome to the Progress Report.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. So let's just go right in and let's just talk about trust. Why is trust such a critical factor for state and local governments in today's digital age? And I'm going to, either one of you can take that question first.
Trust is so important just because communities really rely on their governments for so many services, everything from public safety to health and human services to transportation, across the board, right? There's a lot of expectations for state and local government from their communities. And so I think without that trust, you end up with, am I able to get the services I need? And I think one really important factor in that too is as the tech industry continues to evolve rapidly, I think the expectation from an individual's personal life or just everyday life kind of carries over into their life or expectation from their local community services. And so you have this continual evolution that, the state and local governments need to keep up with.
But I'm curious then, how are the digital systems then shaping? Like, how do you set up a system that shapes that level of confidence in public services?
Personally, I think it's making systems that are easily accessible and integrated and transparent. I mean, those would be the three things that I would say. So something that is easy to use for a user and integrated across systems so that I don't have to enter my data 16 times. Every time I enter my personal information, I get a little worried about what's it going to be used for. So I think systems that allow me to enter it once and know what areas that I need help with, I think becomes a little bit more an ability for me to be able to trust it. I think outages, system disruptions become deterrents for people to use the systems that they need to kind of enhance their lives.
Yes.
And I think that, again, the integration across the applications and communication and transparency, I think those are just some key tenets of building trust within citizens and wanting to be able to use the systems that benefit them.
100%. Yeah, I would just reiterate what Anita mentioned. I think, trust takes a long time to build and a very short time to lose. So if you're like, hey, my expectation is that this system's going to work, it's not just one repetition or two repetitions where you need to see it work and you need to see it work consistently. And to Anita's point, if something fails or there's an outage, that's what you remember. You remember this sort of negative experience. And so there is a high expectation that things are just going to work, but they need to work consistently. So I think in order to build that trust, you have to have a consistent sort of measured approach to delivering the necessary services. And you do need to focus on those baseline foundational things like high availability, like cybersecurity, like the really sort of core building blocks here over some, in some cases it's like, oh, there's some really cool feature or functionality, but if the system doesn't work and consistently, it's easy to lose trust.
I think it's imperative that everybody is working on how do we leverage the technology and the advancement of technology, thinking about AI, et cetera, into our systems to develop and create a better and optimal user experience. And I don't know that our legacy systems are as capable of doing that as some of the more modern systems. So I think it's a fine balance between how long can you use your legacy systems? How do we start to think about getting to more modern systems that, again, do more of a connectivity and give more transparency to users, and also keep up with security?
Yeah, I mean, AI is kind of fundamentally changing a lot about how operations are done, and I think the goal here, again, going back to that trust, is making sure that the focused attention that you put on the activities that you're leveraging AI for are done in a way where it sort of makes sense to everybody in the community, right? So to give an example of that, if there's something like, um, let's say it's a 911 center, and 911 centers get a lot of phone calls every day. Many of those phone calls are not emergencies, right? In some cases, it's a person didn't know where to go. They made a call to the 911 center. Maybe they used the 10-digit line for the 911 center because they didn't want to disrupt the 911 emergency line. And so they make a call and they ask a question that's pretty mundane, like, "Oh, I need to know, what day is recycling pickup." And so that, when in many cases that ties up a human call taker, right? Because the human call taker is answering both the 911 line as well as the administrative line. And so if you're going to say, hey, maybe we can use some of these new capabilities, these new artificial intelligence capabilities, to offload that question. The AI can answer that question very easily. Recycling pickup is on Wednesdays. And so rather than tie up the human professional call taker who's trained at handling emergency calls with something that's, just a mundane question, that's a great thing to do. And in many cases, the ratio of these calls is like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 of non-emergencies to emergencies. And so for every, minute, hour you can save of an emergency call taking professional's time, it's that many lives saved, because they can focus on the things that they're trained to do, as opposed to answering a question from the community that should get answered. So I just use that as a good example to say that moving away from those legacy systems, if you're able to integrate some of this new capability, like potentially diverging non-emergency calls with artificial intelligence, it really really helps you do the core mission of what you were sort of signed up to do. But it does require some of those legacy systems be modernized to be able to adopt these new capabilities.
I think part of it too is just education and making sure that people that are performing the services understand the benefit of AI and this modernization, right? There is sometimes a fear of, oh my gosh, my job is going to be gone or taken over, but that's not the case. Your job is going to change, and everybody needs to be able to adapt to the changes in the technology and the job. You have to adapt, you have to adopt, you have to learn how to get to the next level so we continue to progress.
In order to be able to do some of the things we're talking about, how do you actually deal with fragmented data silos, so that you can actually create AI ready environments?
Yeah, in most states, fortunately, unfortunately, each of the agencies sort of are separate and work in a silo. If I need SNAP or TANF, like food nutrition assistance, or healthcare for my children or for myself, it's different agencies that are providing those services. And so I have to set up a username, password for each of those, enter my information into each of those to be able to receive those benefits. And I think there is a huge need for integration across agencies so that it's a one-stop shop. I go into one sort of central repository, I enter my information, and based on the information that I've entered, whether it's my salary, whether it's the location of where I live, number of kids, et cetera, what am I eligible for? Can I get, some of the SNAP? Can I get some of the TANF? Can I get, other services for my family? And right now it doesn't exist. And I think when you talk about user experience and trust, having to go to multiple systems and having to have me figure it out on my own, what I am and what I'm not eligible for, I do think that erodes trust. So what we're seeing in my space, is a lot more RFPs and requests for data lakes or data integration or AI ML on top of data so that we can start to take the data and have it used for people to optimize services. I think this is a bit new in terms of there was this intent of siloed and again, just protecting data individually. But I think that ship has sailed and we've got to get to a better place of serving our citizens and making sure that these applications and the data is integrated so that we can be a one-stop shop and we can do the work on behalf of the citizens to make sure they're getting every single benefit that they are eligible for.
You talked about the 911 example, and Anita, you talked about sort of SNAP benefit those ideas. But could each of you share like a real world example of where just a real world example of how AI systems are improving outcomes?
Yeah, for sure. So the non-emergency one has been great for us. We've had a lot of great success with that. I would say that when you think about, again, this idea of like administrative overhead, in many cases, like if you use transportation as an example, going through renewing your driver's license or renewing your vehicle registration, things like that are historically known as like challenging areas and things that often get joked about. But I think that's another one, right, where we're consistently saying, hey, how can we make this more approachable, easier, more streamlined, all that good stuff. And so a lot of times if you think about a traditional paper process, which takes lots of approvals and sort of lots of stamps and is changing hands and someone has to input data manually, those are the kinds of processes or workflows that are really helpful for having these capabilities. So I would say in the transportation space, specifically with DMVs, we're making a lot of progress there. But it's across the board, public safety, in the judicial process, anything that's sort of like requires and should require a lot of documentation and a good audit trail and a good sort of chain of custody. All of that stuff, it becomes easier when you're adopting some of these capabilities.
It can be, as complex as Doug mentioned, digital ID, right? We do the DMV solution and we do have a digital ID that allows us in the field offices to just scan our phone to access all of our systems. So it really, there's the full realm. And I think in every aspect of government, people are looking at how can we look for better ways of doing it? How can we do self-service on my cell phone, right? I can go into the DMV and ask for a replacement driver's license. I can get my vehicle, my title, my registration. I can do all of that online self-service. And if you think about it, just 5 years ago, I would have to go into a DMV office and request those services through a person physically. And so as we move forward, I think there is a lens and an eye on how do we automate and how do we enable people to have more self-service versus having to talk to a physical person and really leave those matters to the more complex, the more difficult ones to the people, the humans that really need to provide those services.
But that point of the goal is to not eliminate the human interaction. The goal is to focus it on the high value human interactions and where the expertise is. I think that to me is what's exciting about a lot of this, is that people who are experts can focus on the things they're experts in and up the level of services that way.
Let the machines do what they're good at and let the humans do what they're good at, which is that human to human interaction. So I think that's what we're trying to really emphasize, is that it's a focus on making sure that the human to human interaction stays intact and the machine sort of gets out of the way and becomes more self-service for these sort of tasks that shouldn't be difficult to do.
So it's interesting in the Kyndryl readiness report, we identified groups of people we call pace setters, who are the people who are able to actually get AI, have success bringing AI into new workflows. And one of their characteristics is that they're willing to rethink work. They're willing to redesign how things work. So if you think about the DMV, I think we can all agree that nobody enjoys this experience. I'm not the person who's sitting on either side of the desk. It's not good for anyone. And so when we think about, it's an opportunity for us to completely rethink how getting a driver's license works.
Yeah, I think that's great. The sort of it is what it is philosophy of like, well, this is how it works. And it's like, well, does it need to, right? Is there a better way to do it? Is there a more optimal way to do it. And not always, like, efficiency doesn't always equate to the optimal way. Sometimes it's better to be like, a little bit less quote unquote efficient if you're getting the constituent or the community member the support and the help that they need. But it's more about, is there just a better way of doing it? So your point, like rethinking the workflow, rethinking how it's done, and sort of going back, like, could it be done a different way? And that's really, I think, the right way to go about it. Because if you sort of just say, oh, well, it is what it is, I've got these 10 different hoops to jump through and these 10 different hops to go through, maybe it doesn't need to be that way.
And it's an interesting point because a lot of folks are just looking to modernize what they have versus taking a step back and thinking, hey, how do I re-engineer this with the citizen at the center of it, at the nucleus of it, and then create something that really works to improve or optimize the citizen experience. So the DMV example is really interesting. In Arizona, the Arizona DMV team actually created a solution built on the citizen experience. So they took steps and actually looked at process mapping on what are each of the steps that people go through for each of the functions around DMV, and then built a solution that, again, optimizes each of those subsets of processes. Obviously, it takes years to do that, but it's a very different mindset of what's easiest for me as a service provider versus what's best for a customer receiving and consuming the services. And I think as we move forward, especially in state and local government, we need to switch how we think about things, which is, hey, what's easiest for me to stand up as a service provider, mainframe, et cetera, to, hey, how do I meet the needs of the folks that are consuming the services best? And how do I really set myself up for ongoing transformation modernization, right? So I don't just stand still when I have something that works. I think it's a lot about prioritization too, right? There is significant funding issues right now being faced by state and local government agencies, and really trying to figure out what is the biggest bang for your buck, I think becomes very, very important. And I think more than ever, with some of the funding issues that agencies are facing, AI is the answer, right? To the extent that we can adopt AI and have it perform some of the repeatable tasks and services, you start to improve the experience with very little expense, expended as a starting point. But I do think there is a huge sort of pivot in how do we take the funding that we have, how do we prioritize, and how do we maximize the impact to the people that are using the services to the best extent possible.
I'm curious. I'm thinking a little bit. I wanted to kind of bring it back to trust again. So it's interesting in that context that you're talking about when the funding starts to get cut, and how do you figure out where the bang for your buck is? Where do this? Maybe this is a simple question. Where do the citizens sit in that question?
It's funny. I do really think a lot about like Waymo, right, as an example. And this is something, years ago you had to order a taxi, and then we went to Uber, and now we're moving to Waymo. And you look at the success of Waymo in terms of accidents and injuries, it's working, right? So it's almost like building blocks that you have to create to gain the trust of the citizens to say, hey, we know what we're doing, so continue to follow us on this journey. It does take time. I mean, I will say, me personally, if I go to a website and it's not working, or it's down, or it spins, I'm not going to use it. I'll go call the phone number instead. So I think it's part of it is, do the systems work? Am I getting what I need? Is there transparency in what I'm doing? And if it's no to all of those, I probably will not be using those services. But I do think it's building blocks of showing people that what you're doing, it does work. Your personal information is private, and you are receiving services when you take the time to put in all of your information. And I think it's something along those lines. Doug, I'm interested in your viewpoint as well.
Yeah, I think transparency is critical. And I also think that, we need to collect data along the way, because it can't just be like, well, it's better now than it was before. Well, how do you define better? Like in the Waymo example, here were our accidents before, here are accidents after. And so we can have at least some metric under the hood to say this was our baseline and now it is better. But in some cases, it could be qualitative too. Like, survey people, right? Get informal sample sets from the community and say, is it better now? Do you like it? And so that type of thing, to really make sure that along the way you're gathering feedback, you're gathering data to make sure that it's doing the right thing. And if not, have the mechanisms in place to be able to pull back where you need to pull back. But it just goes back to that really foundational point that trust does take a long time to build. I mean, in many cases, you're going to get, the pessimist in the community who will say like, nope, not using it, never going to use it. And it's like, well, yeah, eventually, if they get enough repetitions in too, that they can see the benefit and the value, and so you need to have that like continual feedback loop to make sure that you're instilling that trust. But transparency is absolutely key in that.
Yeah. Where do you think digital ID models fit in to this?
I have some strong opinions on digital ID. So I live in Arizona, which is why I keep citing Arizona as examples, because it's the stuff that I use. But it's really interesting because we went to digital ID years ago, and a lot of places like the airport don't accept it, right? So part of it becomes what is the process behind making sure that that becomes the future versus just relying on sort of the past. I have a digital ID on my phone, and very few places take it. So part of it also is the systems and the users of these solutions actually taking it and promoting the use of it, so we can get to integrated, seamless systems. So I do that's why I was sort of holding back and kind of laughing, because we do have it. It is available, but I would love to be able to use it. My kids at their college and their university, when they go to to a bar, when they go to the DMV, when they go to the airport. But there's so many disparate systems, back to kind of the foundation of our conversation, that some people take it, some people don't, some people take it in a different form. And so this whole uniforming and standardization of what we're using in terms of ID, and then making sure that everybody's accepting it in the form that we've decided, I think becomes a way to move us all forward. But we're just in the middle right now still, where we haven't all accepted and adopted the use of digital ID.
Is there like a prioritization of like where trust is lost most significantly? Like, is there are things that are like sort of small trust, things that wear it down. There's things that are like, if this happens, no one's ever using your system again. So I'm thinking about how do you help someone prioritize where they focus?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's something to be said of like a risk score to any decision being made. So like if let's say that you're making a decision about like digital ID or something, and there's a cybersecurity risk factor, and you haven't clearly addressed it, then the challenge becomes, okay, like that's a catastrophic loss of trust, and then it's going to be really, really difficult to rebuild that. So those sort of like big rocks, in the sort of rock analogy of filling up the jar, like you want to focus on those foundational components: cybersecurity, availability. It's got to work. It's got to be usable. It's got to be performant, because like Anita was saying, I have the same behavior. If I click a button and it's a sluggish response, or it doesn't respond, I have an expectation that it's going to respond. And so performance is up there. And so once you address those kind of big rocks, I think then you can start to address the finer tuning and the smaller pieces about, how should this workflow work? Is it too cumbersome? Should we update the workflow? Things like that. And being willing to be flexible and adaptable on those second order rocks. But the big foundational components are the ones where I think trust can be lost very quickly. And if you're not able to be confident in that in the deployment, I think that's where you want to be ultra confident, and then move forward with kind of those secondary efforts.
I'm curious, sort of as we think going into the future, and as AI, we go a few years in where it's much more integrated into the work that we're doing. How do you think that governments should measure trust against performance? Do you your thoughts on trust measurements?
I don't think there's any, like, in the past we used to talk about like, oh, there's the curse of dimensionality and like gathering too much. Like, I don't think that really applies anymore, right? I think it's about gather as much data as you can, and then use your own evaluation criteria to determine how you would weight any given feedback.
Yeah.
So maybe the constituent or the community feedback that you're getting is like weighted the most heavily. And then you have, again, these other observability metrics that you're capturing as part of the application build out. But continually in inspecting those and course correcting is important. And so let's say that you, along the way, after you do 90 days of this new way of approaching something, if you get feedback that it needs to course correct, being willing to course correct is also part of the equation here. Because just because you have the data that says, hey, we should probably do this a different way, is not meaningful unless you actually act on that data and then do it in a different way. And so I think that helps build trust, because you can say, oh, as a community member, I gave that feedback, and then I saw 3-4 months later, it actually changed based on some of the feedback I gave, or at least the community members gave. And that actually helps build trust. So in some cases, it's like, yeah, maybe you didn't have the best out of the gate, and that's really hard to come back from. But if you can make sure that you're hearing them and then adapt based on that feedback, that's a really strong way to continue to reinstill that trust.
I also think that when you talk about the most important metric maybe is usage, right? When people are using the systems that have been rolled out for them to leverage, that to me is an indication that they're starting to trust and they value the systems and the outcomes that they're getting. So back to our favorite DMV example, right? Instead of people going into the field offices, they're now using the systems on their phone, on their laptops. To me, that's a success story, right? So that means that they trust logging into their account from a laptop or a cell phone. They're having their services completed, right? Instead of having to go to the agency, they're now having their services completed through a laptop. And the volume of those going up and the number of visits to the DMV, that to me is an indication of success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I think about this a lot. It's the outcomes. I mean, this is why we do all of this. It's not because of AI. It's not because of data. It's because people need to get something done. They need to get something done. They have an outcome to get to, and we have some new interesting ways to help us do that more effectively if we do them right.
There's a movie called Hidden Figures that came out a few years ago about women who were doing manual calculations to help to get spaceships to the moon. And they were eventually replaced by IBM mainframes. And those women basically took that opportunity to learn how to code on the mainframe instead of doing all the manual calculations. And so I think about that a lot in my life, which is we have so much to learn and so much to absorb in terms of moving forward. And to the extent that we can educate ourselves, and that to the extent that we can be open, and to the extent that we're curious about what is out there and how to use it, I think that's what helps propel us forward. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to continue our learning journey and really understand what's out there, and being able to translate into how it helps us with our day-to-day lives in, personally, professionally, and in every aspect of our lives.
Excellent. Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I'm sure that we could go and talk for another hour, but I really thank you both for joining us on the Progress Report. It's been really lovely.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
so much.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us on the Progress Report today. And if you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe, and you can find it on any of the services where you get your podcasts.